we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Hello, and welcome to the Multipolarity War Room. Today we're doing two audio essays, and I'll be tackling mainly the economic and financial ramifications of this war, which are becoming increasingly apparent, and which, as we'll see, in many ways are the main consequences of this war. Apart from the reshaping of the Middle East, which I won't get into, this will be the main consequence of the war. And in a sense, for most of the world, for most of the people living in the world that don't live in the Middle East, the main impact that the war will have will be the reshaping, or the acceleration of the reshaping of the international financial system. And between here and there is potentially a recession or even a depression. Probably, you can never say for sure, but unless things wind down very quickly, that's the direction we're heading in. I'll give a very brief kind of war update, because Andrew and I are following the war quite closely. If people are on my Twitter account, a friend of mine accused me of spam the other day, which is probably true, but there's a real lack of good coverage of the war out there, and I know some people who are in decision-making positions, or at least at a low level, who are becoming more critical of the war, are looking for those sources of information. So if people are following me on X and are sick of updates every 40 minutes, I apologize. But it is important. I'm recording on Tuesday, and right now the war is going extremely bad for the United States and for Israel. There are already initial feelers being put out by both the US and Israel to wind down the war. And we'll get back to that later, because it's the time horizon on how long this goes on for is very important. My sense is that most of the early warning radars have been destroyed in the Middle East. And these early warning radars are more important than many people think, because basically, it's a slightly cynical calculation, but if you have key assets, and usually I mean by key assets, air assets, so planes, refueling planes, bombers, that kind of thing, but also assets in terms of military command and intelligence and so on, which are also needed for these sorts of operations. If you have those assets and you have an early warning radar, when you hear that the ballistic missiles go up, you have, 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. You have a little while to get out of the way, right? So the planes can be got up in the air, for example, and if you're in a building doing, command and control stuff, you can get out, or you can go to the bunker or whatever. And so once you don't have early warning radar, you're kind of a sitting duck, and the planes are a sitting duck too. So my sense is that the early warning radar is out. There's basically no air defense left for the Israelis and the Americans. The air defense didn't work particularly well anyway. But my theory is that they massively concentrated the good air defense, the newer missiles, the THAAD batteries and so on, around key strategic assets. And if you fired enough of these missiles into the sky, you could take out, the one or two ballistic missiles that was coming for that asset. So the combination of air defense and early warning radar meant that you could protect key military assets. And I think that's no longer the case. I think those early warning radars are basically gone now. So in theory, that should be the beginning of the end, really. I mean, the Americans and the Israelis could, drop some more bombs. Increasingly, they'll be shortening the range of the munitions they're using. They'll have used all their long-range standoff munitions. They'll move to more short-range ones, maybe up to and including glide bombs, which you can only use a couple of kilometers out, miles for our American listeners. And you can do that, or you can put, B-52s in the air. I saw B-52s in Britain. You can do all that, but you're taking more risk for each bombing run, because the planes are getting closer. And with stuff like B-52s and so on, they're pretty hard to shoot down because they fly so high. But you are still risking them. If there's an S-300 active, which there probably is somewhere in Iran, you are still risking them. But if you put them up in the air, it's pretty limited, the amount of bombs that they can drop. We had Malcolm Chena on the show last week, and he kind of made clear the logistics you need for a truly mass bombing campaign. I don't think these logistics exist anywhere in the world today. I think even China, Russia, and America, if they combined their air power, probably couldn't pull off the Allies' strategic bombing campaigns in World War II. And I will say, thank God for that. They were horrific and probably war crimes, let's be honest. So it's good that we don't have that amount of destructive power. So in theory, taking all that into account, the war should actually be coming to a close, at least on the American and the Israeli side. Or should be slipping into some very limited war that, maybe a bombing run every few days or something like that. I think that will be sustainable, at least for a little while, with massively escalated risk, of course. But we'll get back to that shortly because it is important. So the economic situation in the relatively short term, I think it's now being discussed in the newspapers. We've been discussing these sorts of issues on Multipolarity, the podcast, since we started. We became particularly focused on the issues around the Middle East, on these issues with the closing of various seas and so on, when the Houthis, or Ansar Allah as they call themselves, started firing missiles at ships. And what's going on in Iran right now is kind of a scaled up version of the Houthi attacks. You have a much more important area, which is the Strait of Hormuz, and you have a much more formidable force. You have the entire Iranian military, with its extensive missiles. It still does have a navy. The Americans have put a lot of effort into destroying their navy, which, by the way, I think was pretty predictable, and I think the Iranians wasted an awful lot of money on that navy, and they wasted some lives too. And I hope moving forward that is actually a lesson to all militaries. Navies aren't that useful, but they still have the smaller naval assets, the speedboats, which I heard some rumors a speedboat had attacked an oil tanker, but I don't think anyone can be sure. And I think they still have the capacities to lay mines, which would be something else that they could do in Hormuz. But the main thing preventing the ships from getting in and out of the Strait are anti-shipping missiles and drones, basically. And that's perfectly sufficient. The Iranians could, even in theory, it would be more easy to hit with air assets, but they could just line, it's such a short gap, they could just line standard artillery up, and then air power would have to go in and try and hit that artillery. They're better off with missiles and drones, but I'm just saying that the Strait of Hormuz is actually a trivial waterway to close, even with very old-fashioned equipment. And Iranian missiles, I hope people now understand, are not old-fashioned. They are more modern than Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Iranians have better missiles than the Americans do. And I really hope people can get that through their heads at this point. So basically, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Every few hours we hear something about it opening back up, and then it turns out it's not open again, and all that. It's closed, okay? The Iranian government for a while denied its closure, and the IRGC said it is closed. I mean, it's probably a bit of good cop, bad cop going on. I don't really know what the game is there, but the IRGC is in control. It's a war machine now. I've said it a million times before. The Iranian nation is a war machine, and the IRGC control it. So the Strait's closed, and it's been closed now for over a week, or a week maybe. And basically that means that significant amounts of oil can't get through the Strait. I think it's about 15% of total oil, might be up to 20. I think it's more 30% or something like that of seaborne oil, which means something because some places can only receive seaborne oil and so on. The Middle East provides certain specific types of oil. I put a chart up on my Twitter showing that jet fuel had like doubled in price immediately, because apparently a lot of the type of oil that's used in jet fuel comes from the Middle East. And I think it's refined and processed. Jet fuel itself is mainly refined and processed in the Middle East. So the oil markets are a very complex beast. And the sorts of oil that come from the Middle East are much more varied than, for example, come from Russia. which, was shut down at one point and caused plenty of disruption. I mean, the sanctions on Russian energy obviously caused an awful lot of chaos and all that. But the Middle East should, in theory, be a lot worse. And that's why we saw such a significant market reaction yesterday, although it's reversed. I'll get back into that in a moment. An awful lot of other products come through the Strait. Fertilizer. We had a hit to fertilizer before because Russia was a big fertilizer producer. I think the Middle East is on balance more important. And I think it's especially more important to American fertilizer. So I saw that today Bloomberg reported that farmers are already lobbying Congress to give them subsidies and tax cuts because their prices are rising. So food prices are going to get hit very, very quickly. And my sense is even just a rise in food prices pretty much ends the Trump presidency. People are very, very sensitive to food price increases all over the world, but especially in America. Food is so expensive in America now. It's almost unimaginable. Much, much more expensive to my mind than in Europe. And Europe's expensive enough. So food prices are enough to kill the Trump administration, in my opinion. And we don't need that long of a fertilizer shock to make a big impact on food prices. So those are the main issues. I mean, there's plenty of other peripheral things that come through the Strait. Anything that's byproduct of oil market, we could go down the list, but it's not that interesting. Mainly it's the shutting off of energy. I suppose the one other thing worth noting is probably the LNG. Some of it now, an increasing amount, has been going to Europe because they've been starved of LNG. I mean, I think some European countries especially are kind of facing now potential gas shortages. The gas storage hasn't been as intense this year as it has been in other years since the beginning of the Ukraine war. I suppose I should address the point that many people are saying, it's mainly Asia that gets its oil from the Middle East. And a decent proportion of the LNG goes to Asia as well, and West Asia, India, and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, but, the oil markets are global, and there's not much you can do about oil market being global. What would you do? Just shut down all exports of oil and LNG? So I guess in theory, America could say, oh, the oil price or the LNG price is going up. Well, we'll shut down all exports of those products. To where? To everywhere? Because if it's not to everywhere, like if you can still sell them to Mexico, well, you can just ship the oil and the LNG down to Mexico, and then, you can resell it on to Europe or to China or whatever. And I suppose if you just cut off Mexico altogether, well, I think that would violate NAFTA and it would cause a lot of problems with the refinery and so on, which I'll talk about in a moment. But my sense is that if you tried to actually close down a regional oil market or a national oil market, it would leak. You'd face the same problem as with the sanctions, except the reverse. You'd be trying to keep things in rather than letting them go out. And you can do that with some things. You can do that with semiconductors and so on. We saw that in China. But they're a very specialized product with a very limited kind of production run. I can only imagine the kind of restraints you'd have to put on oil and gas producers to never sell their oil and gas. And I haven't actually, of all the things I've seen so far, I haven't seen any mention by the Americans that they might try and create an energy autarky and not engage in energy trade at all in the United States. It conceivably could happen, but it just seems unlikely to me. And I suppose that brings us to one of the next key talking points, is that the United States is energy independent. We hear this a lot. It's kind of become a meme. And the idea basically is that in the 1970s, the United States was energy dependent, and that's why it had gas shortages, as the Americans say. That's why they had petroleum shortages and diesel shortages in the 1970s, because we saw something very similar today in 1973. Not a blockade, but an oil embargo by the Arab states, whereas in this case it's a blockade, but the functional effect is still pretty much the same. And basically the United States saw shortages. So the meme about energy independence is basically that since then, oil reserves and so on, and oil production and all this has gotten to the level in the United States that it has its own energy. There's a couple of things about that. First of all, it may be true that the United States can produce enough oil for its consumption. Maybe, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it depends on at what price. And the question there is basically at what price are some of those shale rigs viable? I think also some of the kind of gunky ones, the tar sands and so on. At what price is it viable to extract that stuff and refine it? And I think at a high price. I think for some of the worst stuff, you're probably talking about $150, $160 a barrel. And at that point, yeah, sure, you're, in theory, maybe energy independent if you even are, but, you're energy independent at that price. So you still got to pay the price, guys. So that's the first strain of energy independence, that the meme that's not really understood. The second strain is I'm not even fully convinced that they are energy independent. So if you actually look at the production and consumption numbers from the IEA, well, the first thing that strikes you is the IEA has like some of the dodgiest statistics I've ever come across from any American statistical bureau. I think it's an official government institution. I'd need to check that. If not, it's at least funded or affiliated with the US government. And basically, it's completely lacking in transparency because the NAFTA free trade zone is set up in such a way that America sometimes exports crude to be refined in Mexico, imports it from Canada, sometimes imports it to be refined. The whole thing is this like mess, right? And you don't actually know what's going on in that whole nexus. You only have these really high level figures which tell you absolutely nothing about anything in effect. And they seem almost designed to like convince you that there's energy independence when there may not be. The other issue is that they reduce all the energy, quote unquote, to this standard metric. I think it might be terawatt hours. I should probably check that. But basically, this obscures the fact that there's various different types of energy. So if you have an abundance of gasoline, as the Americans call it, but you have like 40% of or 70% of your commercial fleet need diesel, and you don't have the diesel, well, you're not energy independent, right? So they lump it all in and they measure it together. Anyway, the whole thing seems like a flim-flam to me. They could easily publish much better data on the energy that would be much more useful to the person that studies it, and they don't. And usually if they don't, it's because they don't want to. So the short-term economic effect is risking very high oil prices, very high energy prices for everybody. And yes, I guess the United States could try and cut off energy shipments in and out of the country. Let's see them do it. Big country, complex country. Their energy mix is really weird. There's all these weird refining things in Mexico and imports from Canada and all sorts of things. Not easy to do. So I think basically the TLDR is we're a global oil market, and if the stuff coming out of the Strait of Hormuz hits, it'll just hit everybody. The price will go up and the market will ration accordingly. So let's talk a little bit about the price, because this is an interesting topic. Yesterday on Monday, markets opened with oil going bananas. I think it almost hit 120 a barrel. So it went up from something like 90, maybe it was just below 90, to 120 in a day. And then it basically did a round trip. By the end of the day, it had fallen a little bit above where it had been at the beginning. That's a round trip of $20, $30, maybe, 20, 30, probably maybe $35 at its peak. That's not normal. That is just not normal at any level. So what's going on with the pricing? Well, so the first thing to note is last week, at the end of last week, a report came out via Reuters of an unnamed official in the Trump administration saying that the Treasury was preparing to intervene in the futures market. And I think that is happening. It may not even be the Treasury directly. There are ways of doing this and keeping it off balance sheet. If you have friendly hedge funds or mates at the investment banks, you can get them to do this for you. You have to put a bit of pressure on them because they're going to absorb losses on it, potentially very large losses. But they can, in theory, do it. So, look, the report was out, I think it was Thursday or Friday, that they were going to intervene in the futures market. And so I think there was a bit of that going on. Is that a good idea? I mean, I don't even know how to say how bad an idea that is. I called it online printing oil just because, it's an absurdity. Like, how do you print oil? If the oil doesn't exist, it doesn't exist, right? So if you try and drive down the futures price and it does impact the spot price, and we'll see if it does. We'll see if it does, because I'm not 100% sure that you can actually fully influence the spot price through the futures price. This will be an interesting experiment if they try and do it. Then what you'll do is you'll gin up demand. So, it'll go from having 20 barrels of oil available to 16 barrels of oil, and they'll be priced as if it's 20 barrels of oil. So you'll consume the 16 barrels of oil at the same rate as you'd usually consume 20 barrels of oil. Ergo, you'll run out of oil quickly. So it'll create shortages. It's just a price cap, in effect. It's like doing an actual price cap on a commodity. You'll create shortages if you do that. And you can hand out ration books. We might get there. I'm not actually fundamentally opposed to doing shortages, price subsidies and ration books. It can actually be logical. It worked in the Second World War, and we might be facing then the same kind of shortages as we saw in the Second World War. So I'm open to that. But going in and doing this through the futures market with no backstop in place of how to deal with any oil shortages down the line is bonkers. Just to say, I don't think this is actually the first rodeo. I've said before, I think that the US Treasury's been doing this for a while. People kind of laughed at me on Twitter for suggesting that the oil price was being manipulated, but I'm not the only one that thinks it. I have a bunch of friends who are fund managers, and they showed me some of these weird short positions that were taken out the day after an oil tanker got hit in the Red Sea and stuff like that. Can't tell who the positions are, but they're big, and they come in at an unusual time. So I think they were doing this at the margin ever since the Ukraine war. And now, as with everything, the Trump administration has decided to not just, go big or go home, but also to kind of advertise it to the public. I think there's also kind of a general talking down of the issue. Look, markets are inherently bullish. They kind of track the mood of the average person in the population. And the average person in the population is optimistic. It's just like, I guess as a species, if we weren't on average optimistic, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't have got where we are. So for every, 9 bulls in the market, you have 1 bear or something like that. Maybe it's 8-2 or whatever. The point is that more people are optimistic than are pessimistic. And I think markets in general kind of attract optimistic people, especially traders. Traders tend to be quite an optimistic bunch. So it's pretty easy. It's harder to convince the markets that something bad is happening than convincing them that something good is happening. And so when Trump comes out and makes a noise that he's going to end the war very soon, markets won't realistically evaluate that statement. They'll latch onto it. That's how the psychology of markets is. So I think that the Treasury's engaging in the futures market, but even if they're just manipulating the market through signaling, it does the same thing. Central banks learned this years ago. Yes, you can do open market operations to drive down the interest rate, but you can also just talk it down, and the markets will do it. If they think you're a big enough player, markets will do that. And they've become more sheepish and herd-like as time has gone on with all these interventions by governmental authorities, as central banks, and so on. So the market situation, I would say, is don't fully trust the markets. They have a bunch of biases inbuilt, and they may be being manipulated, not just by active market participants, but also by politicians trying to steer the narrative. The other thing about markets is that they're terrible at geopolitics. I worked in markets for a long time. I had an interest in geopolitics the whole time. I used to always read the papers on it, and I used to kind of try and track what was going on. And the other people didn't know anything. I realized after a while that the only people who you could have a realistic conversation about geopolitics and foreign affairs were foreign people. Usually, people from India usually knew what was up, like smart guys from India or, from Turkey or stuff like that. People who have a kind of geopolitical culture. and are reading the newspapers from back home often kind of know what's going on. Now, occasionally you get people from those parts of the world and they'd come over and they'd almost be propaganda conduits because they didn't like the countries they came from. But, on average, even they were kind of more clued into what was going on, even if they had their own biases. The market guys just don't get geopolitics. They can't get their head around it. They don't have time to pay attention to it. I'm not saying everybody, there are exceptions to this rule, but the vast majority do not know anything about geopolitics. And it's kind of reasonable because most of the time geopolitics doesn't drastically interfere with markets. The view that they do have of geopolitics, by the way, is usually like amateurish to an absurd degree. I mean, it really is kind of like a propagandistic view of the world. They don't know how military stuff works. They don't know how diplomacy works. They don't know how to read any of those signals whatsoever. So they're kind of flying blind anyway. So again, I'd say like be very cautious about especially short-term market moves. So what about the economic situation more long-term? Well, this is the key. This is the real key because it's much more important than an inflationary shock or anything like that. We don't know what direction this is going to go in. If the war drags on for a while, by which I mean if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for a while, we could have a major recession or even a depression. But even if it doesn't remain closed for a long time, the psychological impact that this war has had, the evacuation of capital, which is probably underway, being underreported from Dubai, for example, all of this, the fact that everybody after this war will know that America is not the power that it used to be. And it does not have the military capacities to beat even a relatively poor, but sophisticated, deceptively unsophisticated, you might say, country like Iran. That's going to hit people really hard, and we're never going to be able to unsee that. Everyone's seen it now. Everyone's seen what me and Andrew and Malcolm Cheyune and America Nets recently have been telling people for years. The emperor has not no clothes, but less clothes than what some people think. And everyone's going to see that, and you can't unsee it. So even the psychological impact alone is going to massively accelerate many of the multipolarity trends. I'm thinking about South Korea and Japan realizing that the defense commitments are fake, that they're receiving. Obviously, the Gulf states have learned that the hard way. Nobody wants to go the way of UAE. So they're going to realize that those defense commitments are fake, and they're going to start to pull away from them. And once they start pulling away from the military system, they're going to pull away from the financial system, which they haven't been happy with for a long time, especially since sanctions. So even in an optimistic outcome where the war winds down fast and we don't get a sufficient economic shock to cause a depression or a major recession, I think these processes that we've been discussing on the show for years are going to speed up. And they're going to speed up probably more dramatically than they did after the Ukraine war, which is saying a lot because they really accelerated after the Ukraine war. But in the worst case scenario, the war drags on. Maybe not even for that long. I'm not talking about 6 months. I'm talking about maybe another 6 weeks, maybe less, maybe a little bit more. And markets can't be contained anymore. And we get a full financial markets event. And there are so many fragilities built into that system. I saw a headline today, which is supposed to be the more bullish day when oil prices will come down. And it was a Bloomberg essay saying like everything's under strain. Equities, private credit, private equity, everything's just feeling the strain of these events. And even if that doesn't blow, it shows how fragile the system is. And it is actually going to blow at some point. But, it could take another 5 years. You never know with these things. But if the strain overwhelms all the market optimism and the bullishness and everything I just discussed, it's going to cause a big financial crisis. And this will be the big one. This will be the last one. I don't know if it'll be as big as 2008, slightly less big, bigger. I don't know. But what I do know is it's going to have a long-term impact, a more dramatic and more obvious long-term impact than 2008, because the dollar is going to go the way, well, the dollar hegemony is going to go away after this, and it's going to be the final financial event that before the very rapid unwinding, maybe almost instantaneous unwinding of US dollar hegemony. And that will change the world forever. In the wake of that, we'll probably also need new trade arrangements. It's clear that the open seas US Navy doctrine is completely dead. So if you want to transport your ships around the world now, you're going to have to pay the local piper, right? It'll probably be like paying the local security guard or something like that. You want to go near Iran? Well, you're going to have to, take out an Iranian-Chinese shipping policy, with a Chinese insurance firm, but, the heavies that enforce it, the military that enforces it, might be Iran, for example. That's going to make a lot more sense in the future. And in that circumstance, first of all, the London insurance market's in a lot of trouble. I don't think Lloyd's of London is getting out of this unscathed. But America just won't have that much relevance in much of global trade. Maybe through the Panama Canal, maybe around the Arctic, if they can carve that out with their Greenland strategy and so on. But, it'll have a pretty limited impact. And, the thing that we call the BRICS, this formation of alternative countries, will probably have more control over shipping lanes and so on if that were to come about. So huge economic changes are on the way, I think, either way. But they'll be a lot more noticeable if we get an actual event, a financial markets event. If the Iranians put the squeeze on this and the Americans can't contain the narrative anymore and markets just wake up to what's actually really happening and stop sleepwalking. So just then very quickly on going back to where we began, I said that I thought the war was had reached a point now where it was clear who was going to win the military victory and who was going to lose. And that is clear. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind, unless the Americans pull the discombobulator out of the holster and zap the IRGC. I can't remember what happens. I think you get dizzy and throw up on yourself or something. Maybe you wet yourself. I can't remember what the claim was. But unless they pull out the discombobulator, I mean, it's pretty obvious the trajectory of where this is going. Even if the Americans can sustain a little bit more bombing or whatever, it's pretty obvious where this is going. By the way, I'm being sarcastic. The discombobulator is not real, okay, everybody? So let's just put that away. It's not buried down in Area 51, okay? So I don't think our listeners believe in the discombobulator anyway. But, so it's pretty obvious the trajectory of this thing. We may not see as much. I've noticed that I tweeted today that we're at the point where you get 0% video and 100% intercept rate. I think we're at the censorship phase of the war. We got a lot of information. We got a lot of visuals for the first week or week and a half. And I think now that the early warning radar is down and things are getting quite bad, I think a clampdown is coming and we'll see a lot fewer videos and a lot more claims of 100% interception rate. But look, that's only for the peanut gallery, right? That's only for the punters like us. The guys behind the scene know exactly what's going on. Well, to the extent that they can. They don't have early radars anymore, but they at least know what the hits and so on are going to be. So that's all I wouldn't say 100% clear, but it's becoming kind of increasingly clear, and people can read about it. They'll just read the reactions of the Trump administration or the Israelis, and they'll see a bit of panic setting in, or you can read about how the Iranians are behaving, and they seem to be very confident. Well, here's the thing. All the narrative that's going around, and I think it's being passed around on purpose, is that, of course, once Trump makes the decision, or maybe Trump and Bibi or whatever, and they make the decision to end the war, then the war is over. Just like with the Houthis, the Americans go in there and they try and stamp on the Houthis, and, once they don't get it, they just leave and the Red Sea's still closed or whatever. Yeah, there's a problem with that. The winner in a war gets a vote. The winner in a war gets the main vote. Iran gets a vote. If the Americans and the Israelis declare a ceasefire or put it through back channels that their strikes are going to end or whatever, the Iranians then have decisions to make. They have decisions to make. Do they want to continue hitting Israel with missiles? They have decisions to make. Do they want to extract concessions from the Americans? Multiple concessions. Could be anything. Could be sanctions relief. Could be guarantees on the nuclear program. They're not going to trust the Americans about anything. So even then, you have to be quite creative in thinking up how you do all that. But the question then is, what do the Iranians want? And then tied to that, the question is, do the Iranians immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz? The Iranians are really mad. This isn't something that people don't seem to get. Because I'm just going to be completely frank, I'm not going to play into the, propaganda that you see on the news outlets. The Iranians, from their perspective, those protests, some of them were reasonable protests, no doubt. They were protests against inflation or whatever. They didn't last long. They weren't like super big, maybe they were large protests, but they weren't like life-changing protests. They were like protests about food prices. The violence that took place in those protests, which was, according to the Iranians, incredibly extensive, cannot confirm, but that is the perception in Iran, that there was a mass campaign of violence against police officers and against the state. And from their perspective, that was seeded by foreign powers, okay? So they went through an intense phase of what they see as foreign-funded violence in January. They'd already had a bad experience with the Americans and the Israelis in June of last year, which resulted in the 12-Day War. And then they had their religious leader assassinated. And the new religious leader is his son, so his father's dead. And I think his mother's dead too. And his wife's dead. She was killed in a strike. And his child is dead. So you have a new leader that's more hardline than his father, that doesn't oppose developing a nuclear bomb. And he's had his whole family killed by the people who are going to now turn around and say, yeah, we don't want to do this war anymore. And then you have like a military structure, because that school that was hit, and photos have now come out, and I think even the American press is admitting it was a Tomahawk missile, which is really weird, actually. And I think that school attack is not going to go away anytime soon. That school attack wasn't just on a girls' school. It was on a girls' school near a very prominent military base. And from what I understand, that was basically a bunch of IRGC officers' daughters, children. Okay. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I can tell you, those IRGC commanders don't think it was an accident. So you've got a seriously inflamed leadership class here. And you've got a population that's pretty much as mad as the leadership class. They're getting fed, like, I follow the Iranian news now a little bit, and it's just daily pictures of kids' coffins. Children's coffins. And they're saying that they're fighting the Epstein coalition. That's the talking point. We're fighting the Epstein coalition and they murder children. That's the talking point in Iran. So if you kind of turn around and you say, yeah, we're kind of bored with the war now, bye, I'm not sure it's that easy. So I'm not going to make a bet either way. I'm just highlighting to people that the press assumption that only America and Israel get a vote on the end of this war is untrue. And if you look at the political facts on the ground, from the perceptions of the public to what the leadership class have just been through in Iran, through a series of events that stretch from June, maybe even earlier, up until today. Oh, and add Gaza into the mix. Not very happy about Gaza. And an army that feels like they're really winning a war, which if you go and look at RGC command statements, and they are just flying and they're like heroes at home and everything. You have all that mix in, like, I don't know how easy it is to ask them to stop. So that's pretty much the situation. Also, they'll probably develop a nuclear bomb now. And are the Americans going to try and bomb that? I don't know. So I think that Trump's in this up to his neck. I think it's actually quite hard for him to back away. I hope I'm wrong. I don't want to go through a global depression or global recession or anything like that. We're doom mongers on multipolarity, but ultimately we like having the economy and power and electricity and jobs. I don't want it to happen. I hope that they can wind down the war tomorrow. But I'm just saying, if you look at it objectively, I don't really see that path. I don't see that path right now. So the next few weeks are going to be some of the most eventful, probably in the history of the 20th century. So I don't know. Enjoy the spectacle, I guess, but kind of hard to say because it's actually quite scary and it's really tragic, and a lot of people are losing their lives, and a lot of people might lose their jobs and their fortunes, and we might have energy shortages, you never know. So I guess strap in.
Hello there, Andrew Collingwood interrupting this podcast to let people know that the Multipolarity Substack has been far busier this year than it has been in the past. We've already had articles about how Donald Trump is changing the economic superstructure of the US, both in terms of trade and monetary policy. And today, a bit of academic quality research from Philip Pilkington about de-dollarization. Really, it's like a serious piece of work. So you really should read it if you want to understand that process. We also have every week the Multipolarity Brief, which is a geopolitical roundup. And I got some great direct messages on X and emails about that, giving me fantastic feedback. So very happy with that. Anyway, the content is fantastic. It helps you understand the world. It's a great addition to your weekly listen to Multipolarity, the podcast. So go look for it, Multipolarity, the podcast Substack. You can find it easy. Type in your email, subscribe, simple as that. It's very much worth your while. And now, back to the show. One of the really interesting things about the Iran war is how there are two completely opposite views of how it's going. On the one side, you have those people who say the US is absolutely pounding Iran. It is clearly getting the better of the air war. And the air war is getting better and better for America all of the time. Eventually, Iran is going to crumble and the US is heading for victory. And in fact, a lot of these people say that victory is very close. On the other side, you have people who say that's not the case. In fact, Iran holds the upper hand. And if anybody's going to back down, it's going to be Washington. Both of these cannot be right. And it's a little bit strange, is it not? That we live in this world of very freely available information. It's very unlikely that these days people get caught in information silos. We all pretty much see the same thing. And viewing the same thing, quite serious commentators. I mean, some of them are propagandists. Some of them are like slop accounts. But some are pretty serious people. Some of them have thought about this on each side. And yet, having access to the same information, giving it careful consideration, giving it careful thought, they have come up with completely opposing views. And both of them cannot be right. So why is this? I think the answer is the difference between tactics and strategy. I think the answer is that one side is looking at the tactical situation and the other side is looking at the strategic situation. So what do I mean by that? Well, what's happening at the moment is, in very simple terms, the American and Israeli air forces are conducting air operations against Iran. And actually, they're achieving a lot of tactical successes. In the first days of the war, they killed a lot of the Iranian leadership in the military, political, intelligence area. I mean, even in the religious area, they killed leadership. They had that tactical success. They also destroyed quite a lot of Iran's command and control, both political and military infrastructure. They've also destroyed what I would call civilian military dual use infrastructure as well. They're having these tactical successes. They're also having military tactical successes against the Iranian military, its navy, its air force, such as it was, its air defense, such as it was, and also even some against Iran's ability to fire drone and missiles. So they're having all of these tactical successes. We're seeing all of these tactical successes. And it seems like, and I suppose it's true to a certain degree, Iran is taking a pounding. But let's look at the strategic level. How is the US doing on a strategic level? Well, much less well. At the beginning of the war, the Americans said that their aim was regime change. That was their strategic aim. It was regime change. So have any of these tactical successes moved the US any closer to regime change? It actually seems not. Last week, when the war started, Multipolarity said that air power alone was unlikely to get the US the regime change it wanted. Well, why is that? Well, if you look at the history of using air power in this way, and you read some of the academic research, you very quickly discover that air power has a 100%. Now, I want you to be very clear about that. It has a 100%, a total failure rate when it comes to regime change. It has never on its own achieved regime change. Actually, what the US needs is it needs some individual or group of individuals or some proxy force on the ground that's willing to do Washington's bidding for whatever reason. If it had that, the air power could help them, maybe in some way, achieve, grab hold of the regime and allow the US to get the regime change it wanted. But actually what's happened is the air power alone has probably moved Washington farther away from its strategic aims, because it appears, from what I see on the internet, from fairly reputable sources, that the air power has caused a rally around the flag effect. It's increased nationalism. It's increased support for the current regime. So, in effect, all of these tactical gains have moved the US farther away from its strategic aim of regime change. Let's have a look at the Iranian side of things. Iran's strategic aim was to make the US and Israel stop their attacks and to ensure that the US and Israel would not attack again in the short and medium term. And what they were going to do to try and achieve that, and this has since been confirmed, I've just seen an interview on CNN with the political advisor to the supreme leader of Iran, who confirmed the multipolarity view, that what Iran was seeking to do is it was seeking to inflict as much pain as possible on Washington, so much that Washington would have to back down. And that was going to go through be done either by attacks on America's allies or just through the economic channel, just through causing so much economic pain that the US and Israel would be forced to stop. So how has it been doing? Well, it also has had some tactical successes. For instance, it's destroyed several high-value radar systems, some of which are big kind of radome early warning radars, some of which are smaller and attached to American air defense systems, such as the famous THAAD, the most expensive and complicated air defense system in the world. And Iran has destroyed several of these radars. Well, they do move Iran closer to its strategic aim. Why? Because by destroying those, by blinding the US, by destroying its ability to fire off anti-air interceptors, that makes the remaining missiles and drones within Iran's arsenals more valuable and more likely to be able to inflict more pain, because it's more likely that they'll get through. And in fact, Iran is already causing a lot of pain through its missile and drone attacks on the Gulf states and Israel, and through its closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So in fact, Iran has moved a bit closer to its strategic aim. It's actually got closer to its strategic aim. And I think this really is why there are two opposing views on how the war is going. There are those of us who look at the strategic side of things and say, well, actually, Iran is getting close to its strategic aim. It is actually inflicting some pain already, and this is something that it also has to do to achieve its strategic aim. And then there are other people who just look at the tactical side and say, well, America's kind of winning the air war. It's getting the better of the exchange. It's causing more damage on Iran than Iran is causing on, say, Israel or on Dubai, and certainly on America. Well, so what? Tactics without strategy are the noise before defeat, right? That's how it goes. And that is why there are two different views to the war. So where does this leave us? Well, let's imagine what would have to happen for America to actually get the regime change that it wants, to kick the supreme leader out of Iran and put in place somebody that would be acceptable to Donald Trump, that would be acceptable to Washington. Well, first of all, some leader, some figure in Tehran would have to seize power in Tehran. It would have to grab what remains of national government control of whatever physical infrastructure is still standing. And then because the Iranians have devolved a lot of military decision-making power down to local units, that leader would have to assert control over all of these distributed autonomous military units. Once he had done that, he would have to turn to the population. Now, you have to remember here that Iran had a revolution a bit like Iraq and Syria had revolution, but it was nothing like those revolutions. This was a revolution that created a state that saw itself as intrinsically revolutionary, a bit like, say, Cuba or a bit like the Soviet Union. It saw itself as a revolutionary vanguard state. And it was a revolutionary vanguard state with a religious and theocratic aspect at its constitutional and cultural core. So a new leader would have to go into this country. It would have to say, look, all of that was a terrible mistake. The Iranian Revolution, everything that we believed in moving toward, all of our religious views, the idea that our religion was important and it should be at the center of our society, that whole thing was a terrible mistake. And it had led to us getting bombed into pieces. And the solution, my fellow Iranian citizens, this man would have to say, is not only to make peace with the nations that are currently bombing our schools and our hospitals as well as our military, but the solution is to run our affairs in their interests, not in yours, in theirs. And to that end, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to give up our means to ever defend ourselves in the future. We're going to have to allow the US and perhaps Israel and the UK and France to run combat air patrols over our territory. We're going to have to share intelligence and internal security information with these guys. We're going to have to allow the US and Israel to, militarily interdict people on our territory, to rendition people off our territory as they see fit. And we're going to have to pass legislation that they want, probably to give them control over our natural resources, all of which was exactly why we had the revolution in the first place. But it's been a terrible mistake, so we're going to have to go back to that old regime. Does any of that seem likely at all to any of you listeners? Because it doesn't seem likely to me. It seems not remotely likely. So I suppose the other scenario is that, if the US manages to continue pounding Iran and it really degrades Iran's ability to fire back, eventually there's some kind of failed state scenario where Iran really starts to collapse. Well, the problem with that is that regime fragmentation would multiply the risks. It would multiply the risks that the US faces, that Europe faces, that the broader West faces. The more Iran fragments, the more risks multiply. Why is that? Well, think about it. There would be no central control to prevent random piecemeal attacks on the Strait of Hormuz. There would be no central control to stop terrorist organizations multiplying. There would be no central control to keep Iran's nuclear material out of terrorist hands or out of the hands of other rogue failed nations. Furthermore, all of this instability, all of this internal chaos within Iran would spill out into the region, right? Like, Shia militias in Iraq, for example, might be one vector for that. Shia militias in the Yemen might be another vector. Shia militias in the Lebanon might be another vector. All of this chaos, all of this interethnic strife that would no doubt erupt within Iran could not possibly stay confined within the borders of Iran. These borders weren't drawn up based on ethnic lines. They were drawn up politically. So what you would have is a multiplication of risks, and the US would have to get more involved. It would fear that rival great powers might take advantage of the vacuum. It would fear what happens to Iran's nuclear material. It would fear all of these terrorist organizations that would undoubtedly multiply. It would fear the effect on the global economy and its own corporations as these random attacks in the Strait of Hormuz happened, because there was no central control to stop them from happening. It would fear all of this stuff, so it would have to get involved, and that involvement would be permanent because the state would be permanently fragmented. None of this, therefore, sounds like it's likely that the US is going to get anywhere near its aim of regime change, and it also seems that if it gets a kind of second best option, the kind of, we'll call it the Tel Aviv preference, if you like, of an Iran that just fragments and disintegrates, and all its military energies are turned inward upon itself, well, that seems like something that would just drag the US in. I mean, okay, we wouldn't necessarily have this all-out catastrophe just building up within the global economy, but it would be no good either. The problem is, on the other side of the ledger, the US backing down while Iran still maintains the ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, when Iran still has the ability to hit US allies within the region, would be an unambiguous strategic defeat. It would be something that destroyed the Trump presidency. It would be something that kept the Republican Party out of power for the foreseeable future. It would really be that politically devastating for the US. It would also be a massive strategic turnaround. It would be a massive strategic defeat for the US's global position and its prestige. So for these reasons, the US has got huge incentives to continue fighting. And furthermore, as I said earlier on, Iran is going to want reassurance. It's going to want to know that if it allows if it allows oil and gas to passage through the Strait of Hormuz again, if it stops hurling missiles into Israel and into Dubai and into Bahrain, it's going to want assurance that if it backs down, the US isn't going to come back and attack Iran again in 6 months, in 2 years, in 5 years. It's going to want assurances that Israel isn't going to try the same, right? But what assurances can the US realistically offer here? What can it say? Because already twice now, it has used the process of negotiations as an excuse to attack Iran, and in fact, as a means to aid its attack through decapitation strikes. So it's going to be really difficult just to get negotiations started, let alone to get Iran to trust that those negotiations are in good faith. And as I say, like the US, it's very difficult for the US to offer anything credible because the Israel lobby is so powerful and it cannot tolerate such a strategic defeat. It's going to be very difficult to bring this war to a close. And the strategies of the two sides are absolutely, it seems that there's no landing zone between the two. It seems that negotiations will be extremely difficult and filled with mistrust. And both sides have enormous pressure on them to keep fighting until the bitter end. Iran, because this is an existential issue, and the US, because politically it would be devastating to Trump and the Republican Party, and be a significant strategic. It wouldn't be an existential defeat for the US in the way it would be Iran, but it would be a significant regional turnaround if they were thrust out of the Middle East in some way. So, to conclude, I think this is why there's such a, the difference in tactics and strategy, or the reason why there are two diametrically opposed views. It seems that the US is moving farther away at present from its strategic aim because of the rally around the flag effect. It seems very strange that the US would be able to get anybody to achieve what they would need him to achieve. Very difficult to imagine that somebody would be able to achieve all that in Tehran in the current environment. And finally, it seems that this war has got a lot longer to go because both sides are so strongly incentivized to continue fighting. So I'm sorry to say, but I fully expect us to be having the same discussion next week, by which time the economic pressures on the world will be really starting to get quite frightening. Hopefully, though, somebody will back down by then. Hopefully this will be over by then.